Good morning, everybody. I am Steve Levitsky. I am the director of the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies at Harvard. Welcome to the first Tuesday seminar panel on Argentine politics in 24 years that does not include Vicky Morillo. Vicky, if you're out there, I tried, they wouldn't let me. We are all on Zoom today because they forecasted a couple of centimeters of snow and the entire university flipped out. It is beyond pathetic. Bostonians are turning into snowflakes. For those of you who are in Argentina or otherwise outside of Boston, we barely even had a storm. Darinel took a picture of campus just a few minutes ago. Dari, can you show the picture? This is what it looks like. Okay. This is yet another example of cancel culture run amok. 2 flipping inches of snow and we cancel the in-house Tuesday seminar. Even worse, they cancel the lunch delivery. So I'm sitting here in Dr. class alone and starving. All right. I want to thank, first of all, Darinel, Merced Calderon, our very able coordinator for seamlessly managing our transition, our last-minute transition to Zoom. I also want to introduce, as always, my outstanding co-hosts or co-chairs, Professor Alicia Holland. Professor Holland, you want to say hi? And Professor Francis Agopian.
Hi, welcome everyone.
Today's panel is on the prospects for and the consequences of President Javier Milei's radical reform initiative in Argentina. For a few years, as you all know, it seemed like Argentina might actually miss this wave of outsider presidents that seemed to be sweeping the hemisphere. In both 2015 and 2019, disgruntled Argentines voted out incumbents but turned to political insiders to replace them. But in 2023, amid a severe economic crisis, Argentines did in fact turn to an outsider, Javier Milei. Milei, as you all know, promised a radical restructuring of the Argentine economy, and he took his mandate seriously. Not long after taking office, he sent Congress a massive package of 664 reforms that would not only privatize and deregulate the economy, but would also reform everything from the tax code to the electoral system to the way primaries are held to how soccer teams are governed. Milei also asked, as had previous presidents, to be delegated emergency executive power for 2 years. The bill met some opposition in Congress, which set up a difficult political situation, which we now face. So you have an inexperienced outsider president pursuing radical change in a context of pretty severe crisis. He faces resistance from the Congress, from the judiciary, neither of which he controls. We have seen this sort of situation, this sort of conflict before in Latin America. Newly elected populist president confronts institutions of horizontal accountability. Sometimes the outsider wins, sometimes at the cost of democracy, Fujimori, Correa, Bukele. Sometimes the outsider loses, Fernando Collor, Pedro Castillo. Sometimes the system muddles through, like in Brazil recently under Bolsonaro. To discuss the Argentine case, to look at what is happening, what has happened, what is likely to happen in Argentina, we've got 4 extraordinary panelists, and I will introduce them all in the order they're going to speak before they speak. Leading off will be Sebastián Etchemendy, who is Associate Professor of Political Science at the Torcuato de Tella University and a Senior Researcher at the National Scientific Council, CONICET. Sebastián is a card-carrying member of the Berkeley Mafia, meaning he holds a PhD in political science from the University of California at Berkeley. He specializes in comparative political economy of Latin America and Western Europe, studying the determinants and the political consequences of different processes of economic liberalization, with an emphasis on organized labor. Sebastián is author of many publications, including the outstanding book, Models of Economic Liberalization, Business, Workers, and Compensation in Latin America, Spain, and Portugal, that was published by Cambridge University Press. In 2022, Sebastián was RFK visiting scholar here at Dr. Class, where he fulfilled his one main obligation, which was to bring the World Cup home to Harvard. Welcome, Sebastián.
Thank you.
Our second speaker will be Roberto Gargarella, who is a professor of constitutional law at the University of Buenos Aires, also a senior researcher at CONICET. Roberto is a world-renowned scholar of constitutional law. Among many other publications, he's author of the book, The Legal Foundations of Inequality, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2010. co-editor of Latin American Constitutionalism, The Engine Room of the Constitution, and most recently, an outstanding book, which I really recommend, The Law as a Conversation Among Equals. That was published last year by Cambridge University Press. Roberto has been a recipient, among other things, of the John Simon Guggenheim Scholarship, and most importantly, he is a former Dr. Class visiting scholar. Roberto, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you. Third up is Carla Yumatle, who teaches political theory at the University of Torcuato de Tella. She is another member of the Berkeley Mafia, having earned her PhD in political science at the University of California, Berkeley. Professor Yumatle also did postdoctoral research at Brown University. She's published widely on liberalism, pluralism, human rights, and has co-edited two forthcoming volumes on rethinking U.S.-Latin American relations from the perspective of civil society. She's currently working on a variety of projects on the erosion of democracy, on populism and human rights. And importantly, she will be an RFK visiting scholar here at Harvard next academic year, where she'll be working on a fabulous book project on reconceptualizing populism. So welcome, Carla. Finally, my colleague Federico Sturzenegger is a professor of economics and business at the Universidad de San Andrés and adjunct professor of public policy at the Kennedy School of Government. He's also currently an advisor to President Milei and one of the principal authors of the Milei economic reforms. Professor Sturzenegger holds a PhD in economics from MIT, which we will not hold against him. He has taught economics at UCLA. He served as Secretary of Economic Policy in the federal government back in 2001, served as president of the Central Bank of Buenos Aires, and subsequently president of the Central Bank of the Argentine Republic. Federico, it is a great honor to have you here. Just a few housekeeping items before we start. First of all, Spanish language interpretation is available for this event. You just need to go to the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen. Secondly, we are recording the webinar today, and that will be available via the Dr. Class YouTube channel not too long after the session. Third, and importantly, if you have a question for the panelists, you may ask it, but send that question written through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We will make an effort during the Q&A session to ask as many of your questions as possible. I can't guarantee that we'll get to them all, but I will get to as many as we can. And you should feel free to send your question at any point during the presentations. Okay, we've asked each of our panelists to speak for about 12 minutes, which should leave us hopefully with about half an hour for discussion and Q&A. Again, I will take questions, Alicia and I will take questions from the audience later on. All right, so we begin with Sebastián Etchemendy. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I will assess Milei's government from a political economy perspective. I will divide my presentation in three parts. First, I will give sort of a general view. Second, I will give some brief policy examples. And in the end, I will say something on future prospects. The general view. I mean, if you're standing in Argentina on December 2023, when this government took office, you would say that Argentina has two main priorities. First and foremost, we need a stabilization plan, with rampant annual inflation running at more than 150%. Second, we need a strategy for development in a country that has witnessed erratic growth for the last 10 years. Of course, the past Peronist government did nothing about one, I mean the stabilization plan, and some of the number two, but that is a different question. The point is that in the first 2 months of the Milei government, you don't see an initial hint of any of this. I mean, there is no blueprint of a more or less consistent stabilization plan. All we have is a massive attempt of fiscal adjustment, but there is no clue of what the government is going to do, for example, with the exchange rate, or with wage indexation in a country with strong unions. The government seems to bet on a classic orthodox strategy, whereby you kill aggregate demand to tame inflation. But we have learned from the stabilization packets of the 80s and 90s that pure fiscal adjustment without any compensation is not only socially regressive, it's also not enough to deal with the inflation inertia especially under democratic governance. Some people say, well, even if you're going to do a more consistent stabilization plan in the future, you need fiscal adjustment in the first place. Fair enough. The issue is that for the moment, there is not a minimum sign that the government is thinking on that more complex approach. Some economists point to the fact that, unlike in the orthodox checklist, the government set low interest rates to favor the run from the peso, which is coherent with the dollarization strategy. But again, there is not a consistent plan towards that end either. Let's go to the development growth front. The government has unveiled, as Steve said, two macro legislation packets, one by decree, one sent to Congress, that mandate a massive deregulation of the economy, basically lifting impediments for big business to operate, and which destroy a good chunk of labor protections and union rights. There is no bet on strategic sectors or industrializing old or new commodities with which the country is endowed, like soy or lithium. There is no investment regime to promote research or technology in the local markets, etc. What we have empirically in general terms is an attempt of massive redistribution of social and political power from the popular sectors and the middle classes to the most concentrated business groups. The conception of development behind all this is an ideological project. It is simply free hand for big business. I mean, it is doubtful that banning a subcontracted worker from suing the mother company in case of a work accident, or letting international firms fish with almost no limits in Argentine waters is going to bring growth in the short or medium term, right? But let me give you a couple of policy examples that reveal, in my view, the nature of the government to deal with the real political economy. It has some technical details, but I'll be quick. Argentina has a relatively important biofuels industry. The agrarian provinces of the center, like Córdoba, Santa Fe, produce ethanol and biodiesel out of corn, soybeans, and sugarcane, which are added to refined oil to produce gas for vehicles, right? Currently, there are three main regulations here. There is a minimum percentage of biofuels that oil companies must include in their gas production. 2, oil companies cannot enter the biofuels business and concentrated markets. And 3, there is a market quota for small biofuels producers. So Milei's packet repeals all 3 provisions. The question is the fact that oil companies or big soybean exporters can take over the biofuels industry going to promote more development of the energy sector? It is debatable. When you read the experts, some say yes, some say no. But more important, it is not politically sustainable. The center provinces are home to a powerful lobby of agrarian producers of biofuels. They are joined by unions because soybeans and corn are processed in plant with workers, right? So the governors of Córdoba and Santa Fe, who have these actors on their shoulders, are saying, why are you doing this? Why are you letting the big oil companies, that on top of all this, they come from the southern provinces of Patagonia, come here and wipe out my friends? Remember, both the governors and the rural biofuels producers that lobby them are center-right people, not Peronist leftists. They are a former Macri base that Milei needs desperately if he wants to govern with Congress. So the governors put their legislature to work, and the reform was, not surprisingly, rejected. Second example, we go to the popular sector side of the political economy. There was a big jump in inflation after 100% devaluation in December, and the government has stopped sending food to the soup kitchens in the poor areas of Greater Buenos Aires that feed people. So the leaders of the social movements that administer those soup kitchens and community centers, they went to protest in front of the Ministry of Social Development. The minister, Sandra Petrovelo, goes out and she says she's not going to talk to any of these organization leaders, that she wants no intermediation. She wants to talk directly with poor people. Why? Because the leaders of these social movements are, of course, mostly Peronist and leftists. So she announces on Twitter that she will sit in the desk in front of the ministry to sign up poor people individually to get aid. I have a photo of this. Here it is. This photo can be entitled, Minister of Social Affairs waiting for the poor to come individually to sign up for aid. Of course, no poor family came, right? First of all, I mean, most poor areas are, hour and a half from there. Now, this is like the richest part of the city of Buenos Aires. But most importantly, those of us who study social science know that these organizations provide not only resources to poor families, but crucially, socialization and community bonds. Few humble families who survive by the day are going to wake up and go individually to talk to the minister. So the minister is trying to find now alternative evangelical organizations to channel this social aid. The problem is that it is estimated that these evangelical community centers reach around 30,000 people, and social movements are estimated to provide meals to around 1.5 million people. So these two brief examples reveal that beyond or perhaps because of the government market fundamentalism, we see an amazing incapacity to deal with real actors. And this is important, real actors of both right and left of the political economy. So, like many contemporary far-right governments, the Milei one is difficult to classify. It has legitimate democratic origins. For the moment, it has not crossed the red lines to non-democracy. But it has clearly an authoritarian approach. I mean, for example, the president uses Twitter to insult and target figures from the opposition and theoretical allies also all the time. So this is, of course, a president with authoritarian inclinations whose only potential coalitions is, however, mostly democratic. Center-right and centrist groups, the UCR, and dissident Peronists. So if I would advise Milei, I mean, well, I would never advise a far-right government, but anyway, I would tell him, you need to build a stable coalition. The comparison with Bolsonaro here is telling. Bolsonaro had the Centrao. The Centrao is a group of legislators with loose party loyalties that are relatively easy to buy off, right? He also had Bolsonaro the evangelicals, the big agribusiness, and the states they rule, right? The regions they rule, and the military as a more or less coherent group. Milei has nothing of that sort. So two final points about the future. First, the plebiscitarian road. Many governments in Latin America of both left and right have attempted to govern without Congress and establish political class, with a variety of means, aside from the military self-coup, right? They have organized referendums, constitutional conventions, they have reshaped Congress, be them Chavez or Bukele. But this is a different society from El Salvador. Here you have powerful governors, unions, relatively diversified business, and probably the strongest human rights movement in Latin America. I might be mistaken, but I don't think this is going to work. I don't see a plebiscitarian road in Argentina. Finally, in a short paper we did with an economist colleague, Federico Pastrana, for a think tank, Fundar, in Buenos Aires, we reviewed all the cases comparable to Argentina in Latin America, plus Israel, that have controlled inflations of more than 100% a year. All show one of the following features that I will tell you. One, first, they closed some deal with the main business and labor groups for incomes policy that would distribute the costs of adjustment Israel or Mexico. Two, they had hyperinflation behind, which increased the tolerance for adjustment and broke indexation patterns, right? Argentina and Brazil in the 90s. And three, there was open repression like Chile under Pinochet or Fujimori. I think this government cannot go for the strategy one, a sort of a pact over economic stabilization. It is too ideological and authoritarian for that. So taking this comparative perspective, one is left to think it would be difficult to achieve its goal of lowering inflation without hyperinflation or without repression. I could speak more in the Q&A about these comparative contrasts, but I'm done from here.
Yes, sir. And right on time. Our second speaker is Professor Gargarella. Roberto.
Yes, thank you so much for inviting me. And it's an honor to be here with all these great colleagues. I want to say something about the law and the government. So I will briefly refer to the decree, to the three main pieces of legislation: the decree, the law package that was sent to Congress, or the legal package, and also the anti-picketeer protocol. But before, I want to make a previous comment about constitutionalism and democracy. It's a more abstract thing, but I think it's interesting, or maybe interesting, to understand the origins of this evil, no? And I call this evil the presence of authoritarian governments in the Americas. So the more abstract things. Many important political science professors, like Steve, have been studying recently the influence that the rules have in the creation of like minority governance. So Steve, like last book, was about the tyranny of the minority, in a way going back to what Robert Dahl had written many years ago about how undemocratic is our constitution, or how so how democratic is our constitution. And so I think that there is a lot of talk about the change of attitudes, the change of preferences, or the influence of the new technologies in creating this extremism. But my guess, and I want to say something about that, is that the rules of the game are crucial in helping us explaining what is happening. So for example, Steve and Dahl, etc., they were saying, I mean, the certain constitutional rules, like the existence of the Electoral College, or the existence of the Senate, or the way the senators are elected, or the way the judges are elected, in a way are allowing a minority group or a minority party to become controlling the executive, the legislative, and the court. And that's a problem. Because I have a different understanding of democracy, which is not only related to majority rule, but also to democratic debate, to public debate, I think that we should go one step further and pay attention to the way our rules are not allowing to emerge and to see the important differences, the diversity of opinions that are in Argentina, which are not extreme. So the political leaders are playing the game of all or nothing, and they are playing the extremism. Why? While most of the people clearly distinguish between different policies. So there was just a final note about this first point. There was some few very interesting surveys just after a few weeks after Milei got into the power. And they show that, yes, Milei had important support, but at the same time, people clearly distinguish different policies within, for example, the decree package. And they say, well, I mean, what do you think about the restricting the pensions? 60% against. What do you think about restricting social policies? 60% against. So very interesting. People perfectly distinguish between different policies, but our rules are not allowing these differences to emerge. So at the same time, many people, for example, support changes in the laws controlling the rents. Yes, and that's fine. So people may say yes to certain things and no to many others. And our rules are not, in Argentina and in other countries, are not allowing to see that. And that's a problem because, I mean, then the president comes and acts as if the support that he got during the ballotage is a close, I mean, a strong support to all his policies. And no, people are saying many different things. So just the first point is our rules, the rules of the game are favoring this extremism. So it's not so much that people became right-wing or the people became more extreme or the people are more egoist in the time of the Twitter. I think that a lot has to do with the legal rules, not only majority rule, but also the rules that are not allowing public debate. Well, let's go quickly to the law and the government. I think that what we see when we explore the three main pieces of normative pieces presented by the government is, I would say, a disdain towards the law and a certain contempt towards democracy. And that includes even my good colleague here present, Federico Sturzenegger. If you see what they have been doing with this, you see, so for example, this first protocol anti-picketeers, that seemed to be important because a lot of people complain about lots of people protesting in Argentina, and that's a lot of noise, that's a lot of mess. Well, from the very first minute, we saw that the protocol was against what the basic instructions coming from the Inter-American System of Human Rights. The United Nations, 3 rapporteurs immediately wrote a report saying this is against the law. This is against the Inter-American law. You are not doing it right. They didn't care. Last week, a judge, Casanello, he said, I mean, he has an ideology. He probably is close to the former government, but that doesn't matter. He said what was right. He said, you are going against the Inter-American system. And this is very clear. They didn't care. First thing. Let's go to the decree. The decree is obviously, and I have been commenting this with Federico, the decree is openly against the Constitution. One would say that our present Constitution, the 1994 Constitution, was basically written against presidentialism, against concentration of power, against the possibility that executive rules through decrees. That's the main mission of the 1994 Constitution. About the president legislating, it says all the legislation, I mean, all the attempts, they will be considered totally invalid, nulos de nulidad absoluta e insanable. You don't find stronger words in the Constitution speaking about a certain executive or normative action. It's absolutely against. Then you may try, as for example the Kirchneristas try, dirty tricks in order to maintain in force what is invalid, like Maradona's goal with the hand. So sometimes you do something that is openly invalid, but there are dirty tricks to keep it, to preserve it. We don't want dirty tricks. We don't want dirty tricks. So the main argument that I hear from them is, but many people allow the previous government to do that. I didn't do. And I am a normal citizen. We don't want that, to rule against the mandate of the Constitution. So they are trying to play the dirty tricks played by former government. That's totally unacceptable. Third, the package law. They have less than 50% of the deputies. They have less than 10% of the senators. They need desperately to create consent, and they are breaking all the possibilities of creating consent. So again, I mean, it's well, the project just missed this parliamentary status because an extremely gross mistake. They forgot about how the ruling of the what you need to do in order to follow the procedures by Congress. They forgot, or they didn't know, they ignored that. So they are showing ignorance about the law, democratic disdain, if not democratic contempt. and they are don't taking seriously neither the Constitution nor the law nor the mandates of the inter-American system. Again, I told them as much as I could. I mean, you are going driving a car against the wall. The judges are going to say no, no, and no once and again. They seem not to care. So in all the important legislative normative pieces they are presenting, there is a common thread. They don't care about the legality and the validity, and they are ready to play the dirty tricks. So I conclude with one Rawlsian advice. Rawls said that in situations of uncertainty, you better play safe. So this is the Rawls maximum strategy. So you better choose, I mean, try to, even if all the cards go in the wrong direction, that the situation is you get better off, even if you get all the bad cards. So play safe. My advice is very similar to Sebastián's, even though, I mean, like him, I wouldn't go into an advice to this kind of authoritarian government. It's clearly an authoritarian government, well, and particularly in everything that regards the law. The main lawyer of the state is a former member of the Nazi groups in Argentina, and is one of the most authoritarian expressions of authoritarianism in Argentinian law. so Rodolfo Barra. So what I would say is try to play safe, but what I think they are doing is doing the irrational strategy recognized by Rawls. Instead of playing the maximum, they are playing the maximax. So they imagine if the economy works well, ends up working well, then we win everything and we don't care about democracy and nobody is going to complain about the law, because what matters, what really matters, is that people are, in terms of welfare, are better or are feeling better. So they are playing this incredibly super risky card. If everything goes well, very well in terms of the economic, then we don't care about democracy and about the law. My advice is, in Argentina, things tend to work in the opposite direction. So play safe, try to craft consent, build agreement, build a democratic consensus. They are playing with fire, and I wouldn't care if you are playing fire, you and your friends, but you're playing with our situation, and there are a lot of hurt people, and society is extremely hurt. So I would say, play safe and take care and take democracy seriously. Thank you.
Thank you, Roberto. Professor Yumatle. Carla.
Thank you, Steve. Okay, so I'm going to organize my brief presentation in 3 parts, but before, 2 disclaimers. I assume that there is a sort of heterogeneous audience out there, so it's worth taking 2 minutes to clarify this. First of all, you can attach to everything that I say this motto: it's too early, it's all tentative. So, and I'm going to make some stylistic, even hyperbolic claims due to time restrictions. That doesn't mean that I'm not aware that things admit of more great shades than my statements suggest. And the second caveat that I want to make is nothing of what I say, which of course is not an argument, it's just simply 3 scattered remarks about what tentatively is going on. Nothing of that attributes or hinges upon attaching evil intentions to the president. And in the same vein, if I say something that involves some bleak overtones, that doesn't mean that I desire that, or that I am attaching high probabilities to that. Is again simply tentative remarks of a very brief administration. So again, 3 main points, and I'm going to use the old trick. The first point is about the how, the second point is about the what, and the third point is about the who, and then one wrapping up comment. About the how. Roughly simplifying, one can say that Milei's diagnosis is we need to rescue the market economy from the state, the bureaucracy of the state, from democratic institutions, the Congress, not eliminating the Congress, but taming the Congress, and from democratic civil society, in particular grassroots social movements and organizations dismissively labeled as the managers of poverty. However, I think a likely, without attaching any probabilities to it, a likely outcome is not rescuing the market economy from the state, but the opposite, that the state is captured in a kleptocratic way by those privileged actors who are now enjoying privileged access to the control of the economy. The reason of this disparity, again, all speculatively thinking, the disparity between Milei's endgame and the possible outcome is the following, and is precisely the how and the way that he's trying to implement social reform and transformation, which is a radical, maximalist, erratic, fundamentalist approach at odds with democratic politics. So Milei says that he wants to turn Argentina into the USA or Ireland, Germany, Australia, depending on the week. His foes, his opponents, his anti-models are, on the contrary, Russia and China. And I bring these two examples because I think the case of Russia is a very illustrative point. My point is that whereas Milei wants to turn or become Argentina into the US, he will turn out to turn Argentina into modern Russia. The transition, the historical transition from the Soviet Union to Russia involved a shift of an entire economic model, as Milei intends to do in Argentina. And they ended up with a sort of authoritarian kleptocracy. The small and probably obvious point that I'm making about the how is that it does matter how social transformation is carried out. And it's precisely in the way that this process is being carried out that I put all my reservations. I can say more about why I have these reservations. But I'm not saying that the plan, if there is any, and I endorse Sebastian's qualms about this, that the plan, if there is any, is going to derail. Nor that I'm saying that it's going to derail in this particular way, nor let alone that I desire that that happens. My point again is smaller and simpler, and it is that the transition from the Soviet Union to Russia provides us with a historical lesson, that it does matter how social transformation is carried out, in particular when we intend sweeping and structural transformation. In relation to the what, I want to say that it matters not only that the leader loves what he or she is ruling over, but it matters that he knows and understands the society that he's ruling over. And to put it mildly, I think that Milei's ideal principles are drastically at loggerheads with the social reality he governs. He's implementing reforms out of step with Argentine democratic society. We have been discussing in the public debate the importance of collectivism, the normative affinity of democracy and forms of collective organization. It is not secret that Milei abhors any form of collectivism. And it seems to me that if Milei understands, or I'm not saying that he doesn't understand, but probably if he wouldn't neglect the society that he's ruling upon, he would never discount Argentine civil society. In the anecdote that Sebastián brought about it's not the Minister of Social Development, as Seba said, human labor now is called human capital. Human capital. So welfare programs and human labor is called human capital, and that's the ministry. In that case, there was a second part to Seba's anecdote, which was the aesthetics, ritualistic response to Petovelo's claim. The few days after, you had an endless, long line of individuals. Now, it so happened that it was a social fact. The claim was there is no such thing as simply aggregation of individuals. It was an endless line demanding for the rights. So Argentina has this ritualistic, phenomenal way of turning the language of oppression into the action of resistance. Is spectacular, is worth studying by James Scott, and that it was a magnificent and I think only introductory way of what may come from the reaction from civil society. From descamisados to piqueteros, they have all learned how to mock those above them, and I don't think that this is the exception. Finally, about the who. Who, I'm not going to say who is Milei. The one thing that I want to highlight is that Milei offers a novel, interesting combination of strong leadership without guarantee governability. And when I say no guarantee governability, I'm not talking what Roberto and Sebastián were mentioning about the institutional threats to governability. I'm referring mainly to the lack of political judgment. So there is a quote that I cannot share because I am running out of time, but there is this very famous quote by Weber where he says what politics is about. And he says, well, politics is about the drilling of the slow motion drilling of a very hard wood, no? So going through that, and you need that, for that you need the steady perspective and judgment. And after that, he immediately says, and for that you need a sort of hero. You need someone who is able to forge and envisions horizons that do not exist. Well, Milei displays the second attribute. I have my strong doubts that he displays the first attribute. And what Weber is saying is, in order for the second aspect to function, you have to articulate it with the political judgment. So for now, in terms of who is ruling, we have the enchantment, we have technocracy, but not necessarily the very elusive, difficult wisdom of political judgment. And a final point about this, before going to my final remarks, is the following. Why political judgment matters so much? Precisely because of the ambition, the weight, the scope of Milei's social transformation and economic transformation. Because the political change and transformation that he is intending to carry out, in particular in democratic politics, means always not simply whipping out, extricating, unrooting the problems, but relocating and resignifying the actors and what they may deem as the obstacles. And that relocation, that resignification, that redistribution of social power, moral recognition, social recognition, economic resources requires political judgment, not only the enchantment and the technocratic knowledge. And finally, I want to make a remark on the continuities and fractures of Milei in relation to the past. So there was a very long and ongoing, probably, discussion when Trump took power, whether he was a fascist or not, and it was a very interesting conversation. And there was a sort of version of that debate in Argentina recently. I'm not going to get into that debate, of course. My only point and why I opposed that label is precisely in relation to the understanding of the continuities and fractures of Milei in relation to the past. If we think that he is pure evil, that he is just the fascist evil in democratic politics, tacitly, we are implying that once we remove Milei, democratic normalcy emerges again. And I think that there is no such thing as democratic normalcy, because there is a very long list of preconditions that enable Milei. And obviously, I'm not making any kind of causal claims. I'm saying that there were many conditions that eroded democracy in a significant way. I'm not going to get into that. My final point is simply not the preconditions, but to remark one dimension, one aspect, which is a continuity, and it has been decades in the making, and it is not happening only because of Milei. I'm going to take just 30 more seconds, and I'm over. And that continuity is that democratic politics before Milei, and I am exaggerating the point, has turned into a sort of rapacious politics. And by that, I don't mean simply rampant and unleashed pork barrel policymaking. I mean something different. Just a final quote, and I am not prodding, it's not a jab on any libertarian who may be in the audience. The quote is by Karl Marx. I'm sorry about that. No les estoy mojando la oreja. This quote is phenomenal. I don't know if I can share it. It's just 1 second, Steve. Don't get mad at me. It's one second is okay. So here it is. So Marx is listing Napoleon supporters, and he provides the list: dismissed soldiers, discharged convicts, runaway galley slaves, sharpers, jugglers, lazzaroni, pickpockets, sleight of hand performers, gamblers, procurers, keepers of disorderly houses. It goes on. And here is for me the most important part. In short, that whole undefined, dissolute, kick-about mass that the Frenchman style la bohème. The point again is that was a description of pre-democratic politics, and it characterized politics by the dissolute. And I think that from above and from below, democratic politics in Argentina is reverting into that, which is another way of saying that politics has worn out its democratic ambition. Democratic politics was the bond that transformed the dissoluteness into a collective enterprise. And from below and from above, politics now looks more like this description. Thank you.
Federico, is Argentina turning into Russia?
Well, certainly Milei has caused an impression, correct? It's just only been 2 months and everybody seems to kind of be able to assess, I mean, the nature of the government. But I've really heard things that I find pretty amazing. Roberto says that the government is, and I quote, clearly authoritarian. Carla says the government is at odds with democracy. Roberto says that sending a very comprehensive package to Congress is a disdain for democracy. So to be honest, I'm really kind of shocked by the things I'm hearing, no? Carla says the president doesn't understand what people want. He just got 56% of the vote. Those are bold statements to make, no? And I think what the president feels is that he got a mandate for change. This is an economy since the early 70s has had one of the worst growth performances in the world, where more than 50% of our kids are poor, and people say we need to change this system. I mean, the way the economy is working needs to be changed. What is that has to be changed? What is it that has to be changed? And I tend to say that Argentina, the problem of Argentina is a country which is too stable. No, and when I say that, some people say, what does he mean? Because Argentina, if anything, looks stable, correct? Looks more like a mess rather than stable. But if I were to show you a picture of the union leaders of Argentina today, and we would go back 40 years and take a picture of the union leaders, we'll see that they're exactly the same persons. And when I mean the same person, I'm not being metaphorical. I'm saying the same person with the first name and the same last name. And if you take a picture of the business leaders in Argentina and go back 30 years, you'll see that they're exactly the same people. Exactly the same people. All males, by the way, just as a footnote, I may add that. So basically, Argentina has an economic system where you have a status quo, you have ingrained actors, which basically have created a system which the purpose of which is to extract rents in their favor. This system actually has an interesting political arm to it, which is the Peronist Party. This is why I say that the Peronist Party is the conservative party of Argentina. It's the party of these interest groups. And these interest groups basically execute this policy of appropriating rents from the rest of society. And I think this is what the mandate to change this system, which has worked against the people, is what Milei feels is his mandate. We have normalized amazing things. Let me just give you a few examples. We've normalized that the unions can appropriate between 4 and 4.5% of every worker's wage, either through its management of the health system or through voluntary quote-unquote contributions from workers. So in any other country of the world, you say the unions get 4% of your wage. People say, how can that be possible? We have a country where buying textiles is the most expensive in the world. You get the cheaper textiles in Champs-Élysées than in a typical shop in Buenos Aires. So how could that be? We have a regressive tax structure. The poor pay more taxes than the rich. You say, how can that be? My preferred example of these days, which is fisheries. Basically, we have a system where there's a few fishermen that fish the fish in the sea and basically pay a royalty of 0.15%. So basically, they fish our fish for free. Unfortunately, Sebastián didn't read the project that we sent to the law, which was basically to auction off these fishing rights and to appropriate the rent for the population. And basically, that was it. So actually, we didn't even allow foreign fishers to participate, but just kind of to appropriate the rent from fishing, which for 50 years has been left on the ground. So we've naturalized a lot of these benefits to these interest groups, and we think they're normal. And this is what has to be changed. And so how can you change this system? Because the status quo is very strong, it's very powerful. They control the media, they control the streets, they control, some people may say they control Congress as well, but through lobbying. So what is the strategy to change this system, which is so ingrained in the system? Okay, and one possibility is that is to impoverish these interest groups and to drain them from the resources. And if you do that, then you may have a chance of actually fighting against this interest group. So when people think about the deregulation program in Argentina that President Milei has offered, is much more than an economic deregulation program. Of course, deregulation and bringing competition into the market helps economic growth, but underlying the regulation program, there's also a political program. The political program is to change the structure of power, where the resources are going, and basically weaken the interest groups, which have, as I say, have basically appropriated the resources from the people, have appropriated their wages, have appropriated their fish, have appropriated their clothes, have appropriated basically by taxing them, particularly the poor, so much in favor perhaps of in order to transfer the resources to each of these other groups. The way we've done that is through two legal instruments. One is the decree of necessity and urgency. As Roberto was saying, a very popular way of governing. Alberto Kirchner did 178 of those. Nestor Kirchner did 236 of those, okay? And not really much, people were not much worried about all those decrees of necessity and urgency. I know Roberto has told me that on some specific one of them that he's fought them, but you know, certainly not the 236 or not the 178. So what I'm trying to say is that a lot of the discussion of the decree, I think, has to do with the content, not so much about the form, because the form is totally constitutional. There are mechanisms through which the institutions deal with this, and there's a congressional validation and there's a judicial validation, and certainly those things are playing the role within the rules of our democracy. The decree basically focused on two things: increasing competition in the economy and providing more freedom for people. So, for example, in terms of the competition, the example that I like to give is the health system. Basically, typically what happens is that the unions intermediate the provision of health. They charge on average 3% of the wages to do that intermediation process. Basically, what we've allowed people is to choose freely their health provider and not have to pay that toll for the provision of health services. So, of course, there's a deregulation and an increase in efficiency that is thought out with the reform, but there's also certainly an implication in terms of who gets the money. With a reform, the amount of money that people use for their health system increases 50%, correct? Because typically people contribute 3% of their wages, the business people contribute 6%, so there's 9%, but really so far only 6% of those were being used to buy the health system, and now this goes up to 9%, so that's a 50% increase in the amount of money that people have to pay for their health services instead of paying it to an intermediary, okay? In terms of freedom, we basically redefine the way you interpret commercial and civil code law by basically establishing that in the contract chapter of the civil and commercial code, what people decide on their own will has a prevalence of over what the code says, okay? And so basically it's a way of providing people more freedom to write their contracts. One of the immediate implications of that was rentals, which I think Roberto referred to, and the previous law basically constrained the way you could do a rental contract. This was freed, and then in the 3 or 4 weeks after the decree, the supply of rentals, which had fallen to zero, basically exploded, and the price of rentals fell around 20% in the country. So I would say that it has been very successful. Then the second piece of legislation is the one we sent to Congress, which is, as was said, was very comprehensive. It contains, for example, I think the most important reform in education in 50 years, has the deregulation in insurance, transport, competition, has a new competition law in the credit markets, has changes in culture, has modernization of justice, has energy, has, as was said, an attempt to obtain delegated powers and reform of the state and privatization. And this is the law that went to vote. I think 2 weeks ago, it was voted in favor in Congress. But then when we started discussing the individual items, then we didn't get the vote on some of the key issues. The first item on which we didn't get the vote was something called the fideicomisos, which are like black boxes of money that the political system uses, and we wanted to kind of refurbish those and redesign those. I would say the Congress did not agree with that, and then we decided to lift for the time being the further votes on the law. But this came on the back of a substantial fight for fiscal resources, and so basically the provinces were trying to support some fiscal measures where they could share on the resources, but there weren't the votes for the things that improve the national government, the federal government accounts. And so basically I would say on the background of that debate, which has kind of put on hold, is where the support for the law in general hinges, correct? And remember, over the last 8 years, the share of revenues that go to provinces has moved from 40% of total revenues to 50% of total revenues. So I mean, you want to keep that kind of in the background. Okay, so I would say that today the law is part of a subject to a negotiation or an agreement on the fiscal package. And I would say that's kind of the way democracy works, correct? I mean, democracy is a system where you have different layers, correct? The executive changes very quickly. Then you have the Congress, which changes more slowly. Then you have the judicial system, which changes even more slowly. And that's the way that the system creates some buffers to basically generate a pace of change which is tolerable to society, you know, because no one has the total truth on anything. So it's the whole system has to build a societal truth. And I would say that in my reading of the last 58 days is that democracy has blossomed, because when I was a congressman a few years ago, the Kirchneristas had a majority, so kind of nothing happened in Congress. They just kind of got their laws through without any problem. And but now you have a government which has a strong popular mandate, but has a relatively smaller representation in Congress, and that forces the government to negotiate, to adjust, to change things, to drop other things, etc., and to kind of build a consensual process. And I think that has happened in the last 50 years, sorry, in the last 50 days, in a way that we had not seen in Argentina in many, many years, I would say. So I think that's very, very reassuring, and I think that's very positive. And certainly this is an ongoing process. The fact that the law is suspended now means nothing going forward. It just means that it's part of a process, and it's part of this democratic process, a real democracy, you know, where the president has to negotiate with Congress and to find a common ground. And that's part, except that we're not used to that in Argentina. So that's why kind of people say, oh, you're going too fast, or this is a fight of power, etc. But it's just part of a typical democratic process in any country. So I think I would say democracy has kind of blossomed, not the opposite, in the last 50 days. And the other thing which I think is interesting, and I'm finishing, is that another very positive development is that the government has been able to propose to society a number of debates which were taboo. So it's like things that nobody would dare discuss. Now you can discuss them openly. And I think that is something which is also very positive for a society, to be able to discuss all the problems that it has, okay? So I would say that that's where we are. So you have a government that has operated fully within the law, which plans to continue operating fully within the law, which has a very strong view of things, wants to push that view very strongly. It has to deal with a Congress where it has a relatively minor legislative representation, which basically forces the exercise of democracy in the real sense, and that's the way it is. And it's going to be a process which is going to have successes, it's going to have failures, it's going to have ups and downs. And I believe that to the extent that the government keeps its north and its direction steady over the years and over the months and over the years, the direction will be steady in that direction. So I think that this is the beginning of a long journey, and I think the government has been very decisive in the things that it has done, and now basically it's democracy which will find a way to move forward. So let me stop there.
Thanks, Federico. We have about 20 minutes. I'm going to give you all about 5 or 6 questions, some of which, most of which are taken from the audience. Some of them are directed to individuals, some of them to the group. You should feel free, panelists, to take up the questions that you wish. You no need to do them all. In fact, I encourage you to try to fit your responses into about 3 minutes, so we can hopefully get to a second round. Also, if you want to respond to one another, that's also fair game. So question number 1 is for Sebastián. One of the listeners asked, what would, if you really were an advisor for Milei, what would a Milei coalition look like? Put that coalition together for us. What would it look like?
Could you say for the first part of the question? I didn't hear it well.
If you really were an advisor for Milei, I added that part. No, concretely, what would a successful Milei coalition look like? Tell us that. I thought that was a great question for Roberto, but if anyone wants to take this up, that's fine. Tell us a little bit more about why you think Milei is following this high-risk maxi-max strategy. I agree, it looks pretty high risk to me. Federico may have a different view, but if that's right, why do you think he's doing it? Third and related, and this is for the group, all the panelists except Federico made some comment to the effect of this government lacks political judgment. And the question I have is, do you think he can learn? What's the capacity for learning here? Couple of more questions for Federico. I'm losing my notes. So a couple of people asked what the next steps are now that the initial package has been suspended in Congress, And more generally, though, what cases do you take as a model for democratic reform, for far-reaching reform under democracy? This must be what are positive models that you look to? Finally, there was a question about corruption. It was interesting that there was very little discussion among the panelists about the problem of corruption in Argentina, which is certainly one factor behind Milei's rise. What's the likelihood? What's the capacity that a Milei government has to combat corruption in Argentina? So again, we'll go in the same order that we went with. You take up the questions that you prefer and try to keep it to about 3 minutes. Carla. Oh, excuse me, Sebastián.
Okay. Regarding the coalition, well, it's something I said in the presentation. I mean, and perhaps this is an interesting difference to explore with Bolsonaro. I mean, this is kind of an authoritarian president with authoritarian inclinations, but his coalition, Bolsonaro's coalition, were you would say some other kind of far right or authoritarian people. I mean, the military, for example, or I don't know, some religious groups. Whereas the main potential coalition of Milei are basically democratic forces of the center right, especially the UCR or the center, or, the UCR and centrist parents. So he has a problem there. I mean, if he doesn't change his policy, he won't be able to govern with Congress. He has to change his entire approach, and this is a very ideological precedent for that. Just let me add something. Let me just take briefly something Federico mentioned when he, I mean, the idea that I think it's interesting, right? The idea that we have the same groups here in Argentina, the same politics or the same interest groups for 40 years, right? Which may be true in some sense, but the problem is what is changing. Let me take a kind of side part of what Federico says. On the side, he says, well, all the leaders of the main interest groups are male, as this is danger or this is bad, right? I mean, well, he's part of a government with a misogynist president, right? I mean, who is against women in all fronts, and he has been denounced by the women movement. So my point is, this is not going to change. The fact that we have the same interest group, all male, is bad. We should try to change that. It's not going to change with this type of government. And the same similar things you could add or you could say about the question of interest groups. The groups that are replacing, if all these legislation packets were pushed ahead, the actors that would replace the losers have been in Argentina for 4 years also. I mean, the big HMOs that Federico is favoring with the deregulation decree also have been in Argentina for 4 years. Why are some interest groups that have been a long time bad and the other ones are good? Or the big oil companies that will take over, as I said, part of the biofuels industry or energy sectors have been also interest group in Argentina for 40 years. So the question is, it's not a matter of time. The question is, who are you favoring or not in the political economy, and with what goals, right? The fishing example, I mean, neither Federico or me are experts in the fishing industry. But if you talk, and I did that with the actors of the system, they would say that this complete regulation wouldn't last for a week, that it would implode the whole sector. For example, they took out the obligation to discharge the fish in the ports, in the Argentine ports. So, and everyone in the industry tells you that that is very difficult to control what the firms, the fishing companies fish if you don't make them, discharge that in the ports and check it. So they can go basically and take all the production they want. So again, and let me say a final point about what Federico says, and it's true that there is no. He says, well, democracy is playing. This is a democratic government. True, the government has not passed the red lines for the moment. But remember, Bolsonaro and Trump didn't pass the red lines initially. You could say the same during their governments, right? I mean, these are now kind of authoritarian inclinations, but we're more or less still in a democracy. And then you had January 6th, and then you had the takeover attempt of Congress in the case of Bolsonaro. So I think in that sense, I think it's very prudent to raise the alarms here. Thanks.
Yeah, Roberto.
Yes, one short point about irrationality and one about the disdain of democracy that Federico was mentioning. No, about why would they be choosing this maxima strategy, which is irrational? And I would say because they are irrational, at least the couple of brothers, so Milei and his sister, those who govern Argentina. Well, I think that we tend to overinterpret. We tend to attribute rationality and think, so what they are really doing, I mean, this cannot be true. So I'm sure there is a strategy behind street. There is a calculation. I think that they are irrational. They are acting irrational. I mean, if someone take as a main advisor the dog and he declares it openly, well, I mean, that's not a joke. I don't take that as a joke. I mean, this is what he declared formally. So that's absolutely irrationality, and that's extremely risky. But okay, Federico was saying that I mentioned the disdain of democracy and attributing this disdain because they sent a project to the Congress. No, that's the democratic part. All the rest, what they did, I mean, shows the disdain of democracy. First, beginning from the president. The president, when he got the opportunity, he said that he didn't care about democracy. He said that, I quote, that Arrow had already demonstrated that democracy is useless, that democracy doesn't work. So that's to begin. Second, the main lawyer of the state, Rodolfo Barra, the Nazi that I mentioned, that he recognized himself as Nazi in his youth, 1 week after the government came into power, they said that it was fine to govern through decree. Why? Because, I mean, and then he uses basically the Carl Schmitt argument, again, the Nazi argument. So basically saying, well, you know, and this he wrote in an important newspaper just 1 week after the government came into power. He said, well, you know, Congress tends to be an obstacle. And then he used an argument that also Federico uses a lot, that say, well, I mean, you know, that all these, they have kioscos, they all have the little, I mean, they are all taking their privileges, all the legislators. So let's try, I mean, another way, let's surpass them. So again, this is not me with bad faith attributing something, but this is an open declaration of the main lawyer of the state 1 week after the government came into power. Congress as an obstacle. And the same appears in Federico's declarations when he refers to the legal aspects as the formal aspects. No, but that's just formalities. Those are not formalities. In societies like, I mean, all societies, but democratic societies, when we have very profound disagreements and very profound inequalities, then we desperate need, I mean, to reach agreements. And so when you use as the fair strategy, the strategy of the decree that, as I said, the Constitution condemns it and allows only in exceptional circumstances where the Congress doesn't function and the Congress is functioning. So all you are trying to do through decrees is against the Constitution and is going to be declared unconstitutional by justices. And all the 90% of the many judicial decisions, I think 10 judicial decisions already, say that everything you did with the decree is against the Constitution. So you are choosing a way of acting which goes against the Constitution. So why we need the formalities of the law? Because we disagree. And so if we need to reform Social Security, if we need to reform pensions, if we need to reform the aspects of the renting houses, because we disagree, we need to sit down and reach an agreement. And again, about the anti-democratic aspects of the government, the president said, because I don't want to negotiate anymore in Congress, so let's take out the project from the Congress, and we are not going to discuss it again with them. Why? Because, and I'm quoting the president, because the legislators, the opposition, they are criminals, they are corrupt, they're members of the casta. So, I mean, you talk to me about the disdain of democracy. You should explain, or the government should explain, I mean, what understanding of democracy they have in mind? Because they are deciding to work without Congress. That was the first declaration of the lawyer of the state, and that's what the president is saying. We take the project away from Congress because they are all corrupt and criminals. That's are his words. So I don't have any problem with democracy. The government has a very strong problem with democracy. I'm very afraid in a context and in a country like Argentina, with the history of Argentina, to listen to these voices and to listen to this and to see these actions.
Thanks. Carla.
Yeah. So a couple of things. Federico, I've never said that Milei doesn't understand his voters or why, nothing in relation to that. I simply said that there is a neglect of what is the morphology of Argentine society and the collectivist aspects. And there is a kind of wishful thinking and desire that I think it was tacit in what you were saying, that again, if you just eradicate the middleman, if you just eradicate the tongos, if you just eradicate and eliminate the corruption, everything is going to flow smoothly towards the desired outcome. So just take away the gatekeepers, take away the racketeering, take away the tongos, take away the corporativism and the mafias. Okay, so my point is simply that massive social transformation doesn't happen that way, let alone in Argentine politics, because democratic Argentine politics is rootedly ingrained collectivist. So I mean, it's totally fine to have a democratic president who says, I dislike the collectivist dimensions of democracy because it interferes with efficient outcomes. But then what I am saying, I'm not even giving a value judgment about that. I'm saying what are the practices? How you are going to transform that? What are you going to do to take all of that people and put them all in a rocket to the moon? Not even Macri did that. I think that recently, and forgive me if I am wrong, I think that publicly you said something, and forgive me, I took it from the newspaper, something like, well, Macri made a mistake when he tried to, metaphorically speaking, buy these people out, meaning probably that he gave, probably rightly so, some resources to some actors, political actors who were demanding for those resources. There is, I think, an axiom in Argentine politics, which is any transformation is with all in. That is part of democracy, defined as democracy as a social order, not as a political regime and its institutions. But in particular in Argentina, it's a Peronist legacy that has been transformed and articulated also in liberal ways with Alfonsín. Now, I don't understand what are your plans? What are you going to do? Are you going to divide and let us, I don't know, drift in open ocean? That is one of my points. Second, in the same way, I mean, you said something about freedom and to provide freedom, and I don't quite understand what is your account of freedom there. I mean, it seems that you, again, in the same vein of what I was saying just now, you remove the gatekeepers, you remove the impediments, you remove the interference, which you understand as coercion. Any collectivism is coercion. Therefore, you have more freedom. Now, I think it's part of, maybe you say, well, that's not our account of freedom. But it happens in capitalism that there are many actions that one undertakes that are not coercively imposed. I perform them non-coercively, and yet I do not experience them as mine. And this is a basic understanding of which kind of options I have available, and where I can choose, where I can be a democratic subject. So there are many dimensions that, again, I think that there is some sort of wishful thinking for such a drastic transformation that you want to make. finally, well, there was another point that I want to say, I forgot, but about the learning of political change, of course, yes, of course. I think, of course, Milei can learn. And I think that the same way that I say that we shouldn't discount civil society in Argentina and how it organizes and how it demands and fights for its rights, I think that we shouldn't discount the pedagogic dimension of democracy. And I mean, at some point, before they decided to remove the law, they negotiated, and it seemed, so I don't understand, as Roberto said, why, because you have two scenarios. What would have been better today? To accept the fideicomisos and to have a law, or the present scenario? I don't know. I think that there may be a coalition, and I think that he can learn. And in that sense, again, I don't want to highlight or identify or label Milei as a monster. He's not. There is a massive electorate that for good, sound reasons voted him. And yes, of course, he may learn. It is unclear, though, to add to, and with this I conclude, to add to Roberto's point, again, Federico, it's not a question of whether I like it or not. I made zero value judgment about that. It is unclear, the same way it is unclear which conception of freedom you are working. It is unclear which conception and strategies and practices of social transformation. It is also unclear which kind of democracy. And it may turn out to be that it's a very limited, minimalist, Schumpeterian, constitutional democracy, a sort of corset to everything else. But it is unclear. And at this point, it's all a mess.
I was raising my hand because I know we have only a few minutes and I want to answer. I want to make 4 points.
Federico, no, don't worry. You have your time. You get the final word.
So I also have to teach in 10 minutes. So, okay, anyway, so a few things. Freedom. You know what we mean by freedom? That today I have a middleman which takes 3% of my wage. And I'm going to say, you're going to free to own that 3%, and you're going to be able to do whatever you want with that, okay? That's freedom, and I don't see how you can be against that, okay? And I have unions which basically take 1.5% of my wage, and I don't want them to do so. And I'm going to say, okay, you're going to have the right to say if you want to give that money to the unions or not. I can see how you can be against that, okay? That's what we mean by freedom. And really, you need to have a strategy here, because there have been many attempts to change these interest groups and the system from within. Menem tried it, the Kirchneristas tried it, Macri tried them, and it hasn't happened. In 50 years, they have become stronger and stronger. So our strategy is provide competition, provide freedom, weaken their source of resources, you may have a chance to beat them. It's a strategy. You may agree with it, you may not agree with it, you may think that it's a harsh negotiation, not a harsh negotiation, but there's a strategy, it's a coherent strategy. On the decrease of necessity, I can't, sorry, Roberto, but I can't buy it, you know? I can't buy it, because if the degree of necessity and urgency is so relevant for you, you should have said, and everybody should have said on the decrees, the same thing that they did with this decree. And I repeat, there were 178 decrees in the Alberto Fernandez administration. And there were, okay, so you say, no, I complained against anything. No one complained about any of those, okay? So you may have complained about the COVID decrease, because, you know, this guy did a decree of necessity and urgency and kept the kids out of school for a year and kept us locked for a year, violating all the constitutional rights. But then there were 177 other decrees that no one said. So what I'm saying is, it may be constitutional, it may not be constitutional, it may be challenged judicially, it may be challenged in Congress. It's a normal institutional procedure that all the governments have used and is subject to the controls of the democratic process. So now I think what Sebastián is trying, it's kind of the typical statu quo argument, you know, it's, oh, you're trying to defend someone, no, you're doing these reforms. He did it in his presentation, okay? When you go against the biofuels, it's not because you want to favor the oil companies, it's because you want to favor people, because the biofuels basically make our fuel more expensive. And it's basically a draw. It's basically a drag on our industry. It's a drag on the 45 million people which have to fill their tanks at the pump station, okay? So, but basically one idea, one way the status quo defense itself basically is, oh, you're doing this to benefit someone else. That's why we say that this is not a pro-business government, it's a pro-market business. Because the HMOs that you mentioned, basically what we provide is a competitive environment. First, you had an environment where people could not compete. Okay, have everybody compete, okay? So basically competition is the buzzword, and it's not favoring one or other particular group. Let me just touch my last point on the models. Steve, you asked, what are the models that you have? And I think one very interesting example is the model of Australia in the late 1980s, when they elected a prime minister, which was called Bob Hawke, which, by the way, he was a union leader. He had a finance minister, was Paul Keating. They implemented a process of reforms, a sweeping reform package, very similar to the one Milei is trying to do in Argentina. And they do it through democratic means. They won 4 elections, 3 was Hawke, 1 is Keating. And I just want to, so I think that's a very interesting model for us, okay? But I want you to refer you, a few years ago, I was very curious why the reforms in Australia had endured, while the same reforms that President Menem had attempted in Argentina did not endure. And I was talking about this with the Australian ambassador, and he said, oh, you're so concerned about this question, I'll pay you a ticket to Australia, interview Paul Keating, and ask him this question. So I ended up going to Australia, and I ended up having a long conversation with Paul Keating about the reform process. Okay, and he kind of gave me some views as to why the reform process was successful there or not, which is something we could talk about. But I want to mention the following thing. He said, when you look at the reform process today from afar, it seems that we had everything perfectly planned. And it worked like with clockwork precision, okay? But while we were doing the reform process, I felt like getting home every night as if I would have been skiing all day with only one ski. So what I'm trying to say is that when you do these reforms, when you do these big transformations, it's a process which has successes and failures. It has, you move forward a few steps, then you go back a few steps. The system is kind of trying to basically set a path for you. And it looks kind of, on the ground, it looks messy, like it seems kind of in the discussion we had in this panel today. That's what I was saying. If you have your north clear over the time and you're consistent and you kind of move in the right direction, with all the setbacks, eventually you're going to get there. So let me finish that.
I need to close. Sounds like Federico and I both need to run off to class, but many thanks to Sebastián Etchemendy, Roberto Gargarella, Carla, Yumatle, and Federico Sturzenegger for a fascinating debate. Alicia and I already decided we're going to pick this up a year from now and invite you all back. Take care, everyone.
Bye, thank you.